All right, once again, welcome everyone to this here presentation. It's not part of one of our fancy lecture series, but we appreciate you coming out on this fine Wednesday night. Once again, my name is Thomas McClanagan. I'm the Education Outreach Manager over at the Museum of the Aleutians. Welcome. This is an official Museum of the Aleutians program, so we'd like to take a moment to acknowledge that the Museum of the Aleutians and all of our programming is located on the ancestral and unceded traditional territories of the Ununga. And with that said, I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Magnus, who will be talking about geothermal power. So I'll pass it over and we'll get going.
Yeah, hello. I hope you can hear me, or if not, I use a mic. So please just raise your hand if you can't hear me. Yeah, for me, it's
the mic. It should work.
Yeah, but I think I should be loud enough, or?
Okay, you're good.
So, and just if you can't hear me, just raise your hand and I will switch it on. So I am very honored to be here for a second time in this room to give a presentation on geothermal. I think it was nearly 1 year ago, my first visit to Unalaska. And yeah, first, let me introduce myself. I'm Magnus de Witt. I'm a research assistant professor at the Alaska Center for Energy and Power at the University of Alaska Fairbanks. And my journey started back home in Germany, where I grew up. And after school, I went to Netherlands for a degree in mechanical engineering. And then I continued in Iceland, where I fall in love with geothermal and energy overall. And in Iceland, I got the opportunity to attend the Arctic Circle Assembly, which is one of the largest conferences on Arctic issues. And there I talked to people, and people pointed out that energy security and especially affordability of energy is one of the major issues. And then I said, oh, that sounds very interesting, and maybe renewables could support the energy transition. And that's how I started my academic life with my PhD topic on this. And there I got in touch with ACEP. And after my PhD, I joined ACEP, where I take over some capabilities in terms of geothermal and energy security. 1 year, or a little bit 1.5 years ago, I got contacted by a few people from this community to support the geothermal development, and that's how I ended up here through different channels. And when I planned this current visit, the museum invited me to talk, and I think it's a really great opportunity for me to represent a little bit geothermal, and also it's a very great opportunity to get some of your impressions. So I hope it will be more a dialogue than just a monologue, at least at the end. So today I would like to give you a brief introduction on geothermal, and then I think it's one very interesting part. It's a little bit the history about geothermal, and later I talk a little bit about emerging geothermal technologies and potential new industry. And I have one little caveat, which is not on this table of content. It's a little bit what my students are doing, and I hope that maybe it's a little bit inspirational for the younger generation, how they can contribute, maybe on different levels, maybe school levels, and also on a more academic side. But first, let's take a look. Here we have a world map where we can see the geothermal potential, and we can see one very interesting area which is starting here, going across all the Pacific and then going down over the Aleutian Island arc to South America. And that's one of the very high geothermal active areas. We can also see some spots like Hawaii over there and Iceland. And Iceland, that's a place where I fall in love with geothermal, and I think Iceland has done a lot in terms of geothermal development, and it's always like a kind of light tower project where people come and see, and I try to spread a little bit the experience from Iceland and see what Alaska could learn from this experience. But first, let me start a little bit with the principles of geothermal. So most renewable energies sources are somehow related to the sun. If you have solar energy, it's very obvious that the sun is radiating and generating electricity. But even if you have wind, it's somehow related to the sun, because the sun is creating different temperatures, which is creating the wind flow, which is then propelling the wind turbine. In terms of biomass, it's the same. The sun is fostering the photosynthesis, growth of the plant, and then the plant is used to generate a biomass. Then tidal power, which is maybe not so much used there. It's a little bit different. It's more the sun, moon, earth interplay. But geothermal, it's one of the very few energy resources which is related not to the sun, where we have the nuclear decay in the core of the earth, which is creating heat, and this heat is spreading out from the core to the outer part, to the outer core and to the mantle, and we can utilize this energy resource. Of course, it was very interesting when I was at the school where we saw this huge cross-section of the earth from the core to the crust, where we can see that the crust is relatively thick. But on a few areas, as we have seen before, on the boundary areas of the continental plates, the crust is often relatively shallow, and these are areas where it's relatively easy to access. Because if there are these fractures, we can see that some magma intrusions are coming closer to the surface, so the heat is close to the surface in a reachable distance. And in traditional geothermal, we also need some kind of liquid, some water, and the water is coming through a catchment area. Often the cracks in these very tectonic active areas are helping that the water is flowing down. Then maybe in a permeable area, which is like a kind of bottle where we have an impermeable rock and an impermeable cap rock, and in between we have a permeable layer where water is accumulating, and due to the heat source, it's getting heated up, and then we can tap into this energy source. So while we are tapping into this energy source, we can get hot water out of it. Yeah, okay. Maybe you can hear me now better. Okay. Then I hope that, yeah. Okay, so while we are tapping into this geothermal resource, we get hot water. Of course, it's depending on the area, which kind of temperature we are getting and how deep we are drilling. But usually we can generate, if it's above 120 degrees, we can generate electricity. Of course, there are examples which have lower temperatures. And there we have a lot of different technical options how we utilize this steam. But usually it's going through a steam turbine, which is propelling then the generator and generating electricity. And now it's a very interesting part of geothermal. We can generate the electricity, but on the other hand, we have the hot geothermal water. And this hot geothermal water is providing so much opportunities. So we can use the water which is coming out of the electricity production to utilize it for secondary industries. For example, like swimming pools. For me, it was so amazing when I moved to Iceland that every small village had a swimming pool, because with the excess geothermal water, it was not a big problem to heat the pool. When I was as a kid in Germany, our pools were always cold because it was too expensive to heat them. In Iceland, they were more or less too warm because energy doesn't cost anything. And of course, you can use it for district heating, which is very nice in cold climates. As you know, heat, yeah, it's a big burden. So when I was living in Iceland, you never thought about heating, insulating your house. When I moved to Fairbanks, it's a very different picture when you pay a significant amount for heating your home. So I think that's one of these very great opportunities. And of course, Iceland is very famous for the snow melting of the sidewalks. It's a nice little fun fact. But the more important part is the utilization of this heat for industrial processes. For example, in the fish processing, it could be boiling shrimps, or for canning, drying wood, drying fish, fish farming. And there you see that you have different kind of temperature levels. For example, for boiling, you need boiling hot water, but for fish farming, you just need a little fraction, so you could cascade down the energy. So that makes it, from an economical perspective, so interesting that you can utilize this one resource several times. First for electricity generation, then for high heat processes, then for medium heat and low heat processes. But the big problem with the geothermal is the initial phase. And as you might now from the past here, drilling, it's a very capital intense process, and therefore you have to need to know really good what's below the ground. And in the beginning of a geothermal development process, when you do the surface studies and the exploration, it's relatively low cost and low risk. But the problem is, and there's a real tipping point, it's the test drilling, because you get really good ideas what's below your feet with modern technologies, but still there is some uncertainty. And to overcome this uncertainty, we need some data out of the ground, and the best way is to do some test drilling. And the first well, it's always the riskiest part, where you have to invest a lot of capital to see what's below your feet. And after this drilling, you collected a lot of information, and then you can go forward with the actual planning of the dimension of the reservoir. So how much energy potential is below. According to this reservoir, you can size then the geothermal power plant, and then you can start with a drilling process. And as soon as you hit the drilling process, you have a good understanding, and with every well you drill, you get more information and you get a better picture of what's below the feet. And then the risk is going down with this, and the costs are then stabilizing as soon as you go to the startup and the operation phase of the geothermal power plant. Oh, sorry. Here you can see all the stuff I just told you without going over it. So in Iceland, they had in the beginnings a problem, because in the 1960s, when they started with the geothermal development, it was exactly this risk step where a lot of companies kind of hesitated, because you drilled and you didn't know, do I reach the target? And especially in the 60s, subsurface study were much more vague than nowadays. And then the Icelandic government was a little bit innovative, because they needed energy. They were highly dependent on imported fuels, and they wanted to utilize the local resources. And then they came up with this kind of drilling mitigation fund. This means if you drill and you get a credit, and if you fail, you don't have to pay it back. So they covered this project cost. If you reached your target, then you had to pay back this loan. And this really helped to support the drilling process and helped to take off geothermal integration. And we can see that Iceland had a success rate of 74%. So this means that just a little bit above a quarter of the drillings failed. And of course, with more experience, the drilling success rate is increasing. On the left-hand side, we can see Thor, which is the largest drilling rig in Iceland. And I think Alaska has one additional benefit due to the oil industry. In states, there is a lot of knowledge about drilling. There is a lot of drilling infrastructure, drilling rigs available. So this is one supportive factor for the deployment of a geothermal, that there is already a significant body of knowledge, and the transfer from oil drilling to geothermal drilling, it's not that big. There's a few differences because you are reaching for different geological structures, but this is a relatively minor swing. This is maybe one big advantage of Alaska over other places. And what are the big key takeaways from this exploration phase? It's a little bit that it's really important to have a good understanding of the market, to do a good market analysis, to see what are existing consumers that you can size the geothermal power plant accordingly, but also have a kind of idea what are extension steps. So in Iceland, they figured out that it's not so good to install immediately the full capacity. It's much better to have a plan to slowly and organically let the power plant grow. So that was one lesson learned when they introduced a Headless Harry, one of the largest geothermal power plants that if you introduce it at once, it's risky and it can have some trouble with the reservoir as well. So it's better to do it in slow incremental steps, and it's better for the financial side as well. And it helps you to attract off-takers for the energy. And then, of course, a local evaluation. So it's very important to map the resource well, but it's also important to do a good hazard analysis, because geothermal, due to the nature, it's often in volcanic active areas, and therefore it's really important to figure out where to place it due to energy security concerns, that it's in a very protected areas. For example, Svettingi, it's a geothermal power plant in Iceland, and it's maybe nowadays very famous or maybe it's a power plant not as much as the Blue Lagoon, where a volcano eruption took place over the last 5 years, and I think 2 years ago the eruption was relatively close to the power plant, and a lot of people were worried about it. In Iceland, the main worry was not about the electricity side, it was more about piping the hot water to the community. Because on the electricity side, they could have compensated it, but for the heat supply, it would be even more problematical. And then, of course, for such development, it's of interest to look a little bit, are there kind of secondary industry which could be built around it? And I will talk a little bit about this kind of secondary industries related to geothermal later. And then, of course, grid connection. It's always important how to or where to connect it and how to connect it. And especially in a community like here, where it's, with a fjord, I think the subsea cable would be a good opportunity, but of course there always some risk maybe with it, with anchoring boats, and which maybe has some implications. So lastly, since I started with this large map, I wanted to show you one map. It's from 77, where we can see a little bit more detailed geothermal potential in Alaska, and there we can see that a lot of high potential and high interest areas are located on the Aleutian Island chain. So, oh wait, why is it not going? Sorry. Okay. Okay, what have I done? Okay, that's interesting. Sorry for this. Okay, so sometimes a restart is the best option. So now I would like to talk a little bit about the geothermal history. And I think, as Carl Sagan said, it's always important to know the past to understand the present. And this is a little bit the current track where I try to look a little bit into the history here in Unalaska, how volcanism is a little bit related to the culture, and maybe if you have some stories or other recommendations, then just let me know after the presentation or in the Q&A session. So that would be something of high interest for me to learn from you. So I think geothermal, it started a very long time ago, and in the ancient Romans, they already used geothermal, the Chinese as well, and in Rome, especially in Pompeii, the baths are very famous. And from an engineering point of view, it's so interesting to see how they built the baths, where they had the hot water from the Vesuve going under this floor in this space, and how they've constructed it 2000 years ago, and how it's heating up the surface, that the people had an enjoyable warm marble floor. So this is super exciting to me. And then in modern times, I think the first kind of spa opened in the 1326 in the Belgium city of Spa, which is kind of giving the name for our current modern spas. And it took a long while, but in 1904, Pietro Conti developed the first geothermal generator. He did it in Tuscany in Italy, and he was just capturing the steam which is there naturally occurring. And in 1913, he got a commission to construct the first geothermal power plant, which had a capacity of 250 kilowatts installed power. And this utilizes the dry steam coming directly out of the ground, giving the steam into the turbine. Currently, this technology is not so often done because usually nowadays we take the geothermal fluid, give it to a heat exchanger, and then we have a closed loop for the generating site. Because in geothermal fluids we have a lot of some CO2 and minerals which we usually don't want to have in the air. But I will cover this later. Now a little bit about the Icelandic geothermal history. So in the ancient past, people have used the hot springs for more ritual use, for baptism rituals. And then very famous, if you have visited Iceland, the main shopping street is Lagavegur, which means a washing way, because that was the way to the hot springs where the people went to wash their clothes. And then some farmers started, okay, maybe we can utilize this geothermal source for heating our farms. And that's how it started in Iceland. It was approximately a little bit after the Italians already utilized it for electricity generation. And in the beginning, there was a lot of hesitation and people were not really believing in this energy source. And some external input was needed because in the US, in Boise, they already had a small district heating system, and some people went there and they got some good input from there, and then they said, okay, we can do it the same way. Other politicians were a little bit opposed to it, but in the 1930s to 40s, they started with the first wells, and they drilled it in the city. Here you can see one of the old wells, but the structure around it's new, where they drilled in the city center just to get some hot water. And the old district heating system in the old part where I was living, it was not with a heat exchanger, and your hot water had this sulfur taste and the very famous egg shower. And then it took a little bit longer because often you need some external input or reason to start it. And then the big takeoff, it was in the late 70s, early 80s, and this is a little bit related with the oil crisis. And then later in the late 90s and early 2000s, prior to the Icelandic financial crisis, there was a huge offtake in geothermal. And here we can see how geothermal is dominating the heating sector. So we can see that approximately 90% of the homes in Iceland are heated by geothermal water, and the remaining 10% are heated by electricity, which is then either generated by geothermal or hydropower. And this makes heating very affordable in Iceland. But of course, one thing I want to highlight is the first geothermal power plant in Alaska, Chino Hot Spring. And this is a very interesting power plant because it's a power plant which is operating on the lowest temperature. So they have approximately 75 degrees. I apologize for this, that I should have converted it to Fahrenheit. But I think you can.
170 degrees
Fahrenheit.
170 degrees
100, okay. For next time I will convert it. And there's one big issue. If you have this low temperature, and you need steam. I think it's very obvious from school that water is boiling at 100 degrees, so you need a different fluid, and so they have a different working fluid with it, which is heated with geothermal water, and then this working fluid is working like in a refrigerator, and producing the steam in the steam turbine. Of course, it's a closed loop, and this is also showing how geothermal could help to lower the cost. So they lowered the cost from 30 cents to 0.05 cents dollar, sorry, per kilowatt hour. So now I would like to talk a little bit about the emerging technology. So this is one of the really fascinating parts. And in the beginning, you saw that there are a few special, highly active areas around the continental or tectonic plates. But people in areas where they don't have this fortune to be in these areas, they also would like to utilize geothermal. And so some companies have looked into how they can make geothermal suitable for other areas. And this is one idea. It's called advanced geothermal, and they're utilizing modern drilling technologies and trying to create a kind of heat exchanger subsurface. So in this case, it's, I think, the first power plant of this size, which is built by a Canadian company close to Munich. And I'm not sure how the status is. I think the opening for the electricity generation was last fall. I'm not sure if the district heating system is already operational. But they drilled down 4.5 kilometer, and then they built this kind of piping system. And this piping system is sealed, so there is no water going out or in. So it's a really closed loop. So the cold water is pumped in, going out, going to a heat exchanger, powering the turbine, and then the remaining heat is going into the district heating system. And the advantage of, or the problem is, of course, if you drill, every meter you drill down is more expensive. But for areas like this, especially in Europe where energy prices are relatively high, it's still an affordable technology if you do it on a larger scale. Another very interesting and emerging technology, it's magmatic geothermal, and this happened more or less by an accident, because in Iceland, in the early 2000s, they had this Iceland deep drilling project, where the goal was to drill 4.5 kilometers low to get super hot critical geothermal energy. And there happened one thing, and this was after 2.1 kilometer, the drill bit got stuck. And no one knew what happened, but then they saw, okay, we get a very, very high output. And the output had a very high pressure and a high temperature. And the problem was, it was a very corrosive steam coming out. So at that time, they tried to abandon it. And here you can see they just poured a lot of soil on top and tried to close it down. But you see that it took a lot of time to close down this artificial vent, I would say. And then people abandoned it. And later on, people looked a little bit into this area and saw, okay, we tried to drill in the same area 2 times before, and 2 times we got stuck at the same depths. And then later on, with more modern technology, they mapped it and they saw, okay, there is a relatively shallow magma chamber. And nowadays, they have built the Krafla magma testbed. So Krafla, that's the name of the volcanic system. And now a lot of different companies and universities try to study this magmatic geothermal. So different universities are focusing on developing material which can withstand this high pressure, temperature, and corrosive steam. And the reason behind is, as they drilled it, they saw, okay, the pressure is so high, we could increase the power output per well tenfold. And of course, if you drill and spend a lot of money for one well and you get a 10 times higher output, it would change the economics. That's why they are doing it. Other universities are focusing more on the monitoring, the sensors, because that's another problem. If you drill, have these high temperatures, the current sensors won't withstand it for a long time. So that's why they're looking into different materials, technologies to observe it. And of course, with geothermal, it's often that it's also try to have a second benefit to understand more about the volcanism and how we can use it for volcano monitoring and prediction, because that's of course a safety feature for the population living close by these systems. And another part, it's focusing on the economic, how this technology would change the business case for geothermal. And even if this is taking place in Iceland, it's very interesting for Alaska, because in Alaska on Mount Augustine we have very similar conditions, where we know that there is a relatively shallow magma chamber, so it could be a very interesting future technology to generate electricity. Another now very interesting part, it's surrounding industries. And here we can see it's a very fancy cover for a wellhead in Iceland. And here they tried to re-inject CO2 into the ground to solidify it. And it's carb fix, and they started with re-injecting the CO2 from the geothermal power plant. And on the left-hand side, you can see on your left, there is a core from drilling from the geothermal, or from the volcanic rock, where you can see it's very porous rock. And on the right-hand side, you can see a more solid rock. It's from the same area. It's just before the re-injection, and then it's after the re-injection of the CO2. So you can see that the CO2 is crystallizing in the spaces, in the pores of the rock, and solidify. And this is a great way to capture, or not to capture, but to store the CO2, that it has no way to escape again. And this company is currently expanding. It has now also one direct air capture facility next to this wellhead, and then they are currently planning to, or not planning, they are constructing a terminal close to the shore, where the target is to import CO2 from other places and re-inject it in the Icelandic ground. And they aim to ramp it up and re-inject approximately 3 tons CO2 per year until 31. And here you can see Orca. That is a direct air capture. Maybe it's not easy to see, but it's like a big ventilator which is blowing air through this capture ring device, and then it's purifying the CO2, and then it's getting re-injected. I think this is one very interesting opportunity to see. And then a more practical thing, it's greenhouses. So while I was a master student in Iceland, I was working at a greenhouse, but not one like this. I was working in a greenhouse where we tried to grow algae. It was a startup, and there we had developed a reactor to grow algae where we utilized light, which was powered from geothermal electricity, and then we used a CO2 to inject it in the reactor that the algae grows. And this kind of algae was for cosmetical and medical purposes, and yeah, it had a really high value. And the final idea was to get the CO2 from the geothermal power plant, to get the heat to heat up the greenhouse, and to get the electricity from the geothermal power plant. So nowadays we can see, I think, at least one of these algae farms, which is close to the Blue Lagoon, and we can see a lot of greenhouses in Iceland. Once it was a little bit some low clouds in Iceland, and I was driving in Iceland and I saw a reddish or red yellowish glare in the sky, and it was a shining cloud. And then I realized, oh, it was a greenhouse which was just reflecting so much light into the sky that the clouds were glowing. And in Iceland they are growing a lot of tomatoes, and one of the fun facts is, which really surprised me, that Iceland is even a tomato exporter. They are exporting tomatoes to Greenland. And first in the supermarket, I was a little bit surprised when I saw homegrown tomatoes in the supermarket in Iceland, and a lot of other vegetables like lettuce and cucumbers, beets, and even but I think it's just at the university we have some homegrown bananas, but I think it's just as 2 or 3 banana plants. It's not for sale. But of course, this helps Iceland to be a little bit more food secure, to improve the food security. And I think this could be also for Alaska a good opportunity to have local food sources for all year round, and to shorten the distribution chains, and especially with the harsh climate condition, it's sometimes hard to get goods in. Then, as I mentioned before I come to the end, I would like to highlight a few of my student projects, because I would like to show a little opportunities, and I'm always proud about the results my students are doing. So I think it's always great to show what they're doing. So sometimes it's really interesting how you come back to geothermal. So this was a project a summer intern undergrad student did last year, and I had a discussion. It was more related to shipping, how the shipping sector is using sustainable fuels, because I did a fellowship in Korea, and the Koreans are really far with sustainable fuels for the maritime sector. And then I thought, okay, you visited Unalaska, and I remember last time when I was standing here after this presentation, I had a discussion and someone showed me the logo of the city where Unalaska was put in the middle, and with all the connections around the world. And I said, okay, maybe there's a geothermal potential. It's a real hub. It's well located on the transit route between Northern America and Asia, and it's on the gateway to the Arctic Ocean for the transpolar routes. So maybe it could be of interest to look a little bit into the geothermal to X potential to create a different market. And Emily, she did a really, really great job last year. She wrote one publication which got published in a peer-reviewed journal, and then earlier this year, she got the opportunity with some funding to go and with me to the Arctic Frontiers in Norway, where she got even an Best Poster Award. So that's always really nice. And here we can see one map which is showing how well Unalaska could be connected when the transpolar routes are opening, and that it's, I think, one of the few deep water seaports, norm, which is under discussion for a long time to get a deep sea water port. And with the Mercutian volcano and the geothermal potential, it could be some nice, interesting cross benefits to create an economy to make it more viable to integrate geothermal. Another student of mine, Sydney, he looked a bit into the greenhouse gas emissions. Before I mentioned, there's always a little CO2 released, and here we looked a little bit into the history of geothermal development and how the greenhouse gas emission related to geothermal have changed over time. And it was really interesting to see that during the operation phase, depending on the technology, there is not so much improvement. This is maybe a little bit due to the fact that some carbon capture and sequestration, like in Iceland, it's not very commonly done. But we can see that there is a lot of CO2 savings in the construction phase. And of course, it would be a little bit more interesting to look into the decommissioning phase, but luckily not so many data is available because not so many geothermal power plants have been decommissioned. But overall, we can say that geothermal has a much lower greenhouse gas emission footprint compared to fossil fuels and other technologies. Even if we have wind, solar, we don't have the greenhouse gas emission during the generation phase, but for the production of the PV panels or wind turbines, we emit some CO2. So this year I have two interns which are focusing on geothermal. So I have not so much data at the moment because they just started a few weeks ago. So this is very preliminary. I have one student, Megan, she's looking into mapping geothermal because there's a lot of talk about geothermal in Alaska, and there are a lot of different efforts to map geothermal, to prioritize geothermal projects, but often it's more on an interest base. And we try to look a little bit into where we have geothermal area with a high potential and where do we have a market for geothermal close by, to have a little bit more unbiased view on which areas are of interest for geothermal development. And the second student of mine, Declan, he is looking into how we can use old abandoned wells from oil extraction, because maybe the temperature is not that high, but still at a lot of wells now that we have the sufficient heat for space heating purposes. And we are looking mainly on the Cook Inlet. Our first idea was to just focus on Anchorage, which sources are close to Anchorage, but now we said, okay, there are so many wells that we look also into a little bit other areas close to the Cook Inlet. Because heating, it's a big cost burden, as I mentioned before, and especially in the Cook Inlet with the expected depletion of the natural gas, we need some other energy sources, and maybe abandoned oil wells could help to at least lower a little bit the pressure for other energy sources. And now I would like to open the floor. If you have any questions, feel free to ask. If you have any recommendations for how geothermal or volcanism is related to the local society, it would be great to hear.
I can start us off. I was curious with the Orca carbon recapture project. Is the goal simply to recapture carbon, or is there some sort of use once it's in that more solid state that they could put it to? What's kind of the end goal with that project? Is it just to capture? Or are they looking at industrial uses as well?
Exactly, just to store it. But of course, as I mentioned before, in terms of the greenhouses, it could be of interest to use it there.
So for the district heating, that seems obviously like a pretty useful way to use the waste heat from these power plants. How capital intensive is it to build a district heating system? Is that something that requires a lot of buy-in, a lot of capital to sort of set up? Or is it pretty on par with something like, the propane systems that we see down south in the lower 48? Just pretty simple like those.
Of course, to give a good answer, the study would be needed to exactly evaluate what the transition cost would be. And I think the biggest issue here is that most of the homes, I think, have do you have, I believe, Toyos or no? So if you have water-based heating systems, then it's much easier to have the transition, because then you just have to be connected to a central heating system. But the problem is if you have Toyo stove or forced air heating systems, then you need also to upgrade the houses, and that's a big problem. Okay. So that makes it much easier, because I know from other places that it's often a problem from the buy-in from people, because if you have to kind of redo your house for the heating system, then it's a big problem. But if you have it already installed, then it's much easier to do the transition. Of course, it's capital intense, but if you have a relatively low cost heat source, then over time, yeah, you will have the benefit.
Hello. Thanks so much again for coming and speaking today. So a kind of geothermal that I read about recently was being deployed in places that don't have super accessible high temperature geothermal energy, but are looking at using just the relatively more moderate temperatures underground to reduce heating costs. And so, is this a developing technology? Is this something that's being deployed different places? Because I was reading about a project in North Carolina that was doing this, but I'm curious what your perspective
I
is.
think you are referring to ground source heat pumps, which is a relatively well-developed technology, because basic technology behind it is just a refrigerator. So it's very similar to a fridge or to a normal AC. It's just that you have a different working fluid. So usually you use air to water or air to air, and there you use a water to water heat pump. So this is done in a lot of places. There are two different types. One which is sometimes a little bit more expensive, where you drill wells down, where you get then moderate tempered water, or you build just like a heat exchanger, which is relatively shallow. And I think the shallow one, I don't know if this was tested in under Arctic conditions, but where you drill a well, that's working pretty well, because the advantage is the groundwater has more or less constant temperature, and you know, okay, if it's 7 degrees, you have this kind of efficiency factor. And if you compare it to an air source heat pump, where if you have, I don't know, in Fahrenheit, but if it's below freezing, then it's much more inefficient. But of course, it's easier to install. I'm not sure how cold it's getting here, but yeah, the air source heat pump in Fairbanks area, it doesn't make any sense during the winter, because you can't really utilize it. So it's more or less one-to-one. It's like a direct electrical heating system.
So I know last time you were in town, there was some discussion of doing satellite monitoring in order to discover potentially other different well sites or drilling sites. Has that been done, or are there results from that yet?
As far as I know, it has not done, but not yet. But I think the tribe is still looking into it. But it should be done soon. And as I mentioned, to get this subsurface data, it's very critical to do some well-educated decision.
With the project that one of your students did about the resources that are stranded, will she be expanding on that, or was there anything in particular that stood out to you about our community and the work that she did?
So this will be a more general analysis, and we try to map out all the different communities which have a potential, the size, the energy demand, to see what is of interest. I'm not sure how we will proceed it after the summer project. So the goal is to have one paper coming out of it, because I know that Enroll, they have done a gap analysis, I think 1 year ago, which will hopefully get published soon. But there is more the focus on where are resources, which data are available, and where do scientists like to research more. And I think it's a very important part, but it's not taking all the angles on geothermal and to see where it's of interest to develop.
So based off of some of the maps that you were showing us with like a green dot in Unalaska, are you saying that geothermal is possible in Unalaska?
So if you ask an engineer if something is possible, the answer is always yes. The main question is it feasible as well? And there, I think that's a question I can't answer yet, but I hope with more information it will be possible to answer. Yeah.
And then, and then my follow-up is, so you mentioned it being feasible, and you showed us kind of like that graph of like the different steps. Can you tell me what exactly you mean by feasible? So I guess we know what feasible means, but what are the steps to say when something is feasible, or when a geothermal project is feasible?
You mean the risk map?
Yeah.
Yeah, so I would say it's feasible when we can at least have the same energy cost, and I would assume that it would be even possible long term to lower the energy cost. But of course, that's always a little bit a problem how to finance such projects, because the main issue is you have this very high upfront cost and how to recover this cost over a short time. And I think that's often a problem, that people don't want to wait a decade until they have the benefit. That's something I saw in Greenland, in Nuuk, with the hydropower plant, where the real benefit came, I think, a decade later. So that's often the problem. But of course, in the energy market, you never know, because you have not only the price of energy, you also have the energy security side. And in a remote location like this, it's maybe very beneficial to have a local energy resource, that you are more independent from global market, as we all see now that fuel prices can go with no warnings through the roof. And in Arctic communities, it's often good to be not dependent on shipping in fuels. Maybe here it's a little bit better to reach it during the winter time, but for other parts in the Arctic during winter time, it's not possible to ship it in. And there, I think there is a great benefit of local energy sources in general.
Thank you, and thank you for your presentation. I have a couple just really quick questions. One is, what are the metrics or the markers of a truly sustainable, successful well site?
Mm-hmm.
And the other one is there environmental trade-offs for tapping into this resource for our energy source?
What do you mean by markers for?
What are the metrics? So how long, what's the hydrology marker for how much what's the resource hold? How long do you test that well to make sure the resource is there in the amount that you need it in? Those types of things.
Okay, that's really hard to answer at the current stage. And now from the previous test drilling in the late 70s, I don't know how much energy potential I remember that they expected a very large energy potential, but I can't give you the number out of the top of my head to quote me on it. But for the environmental impact, of course, there is some environmental impact because you have to build infrastructure. You need a road access to get there. Then you have need a drill pad for the construction phase, and afterwards you have the pipeline. So there's always some impact. I think it's hard to construct anything with no impact. I would say that the impact is relatively low, but it's always a definition of it. So you have a relatively little visual impact if you compare it, for example, to wind turbines, because it's all close to the ground. Wind turbines are more raised, so it's more visible from a far distance. I don't know how it's here, because there are some, but I think they're maybe not so like the wild horses, and maybe they're more in other part of the island. So pipelines, they are often a problem for animals, but I think for geothermal it shouldn't be such a big impact because the distance between the wells and the geothermal power plant is relatively low. It would be only a problem if there is a long pipeline from a power plant to a community, because that's some impact I know from the oil extraction in Russia, that it's a problem with migration for reindeers.
Well, I think most energy technology does have externalities, including green technology. So, would geothermal have any issues to public health or the environment during the drilling process or even just daily operation of the plant? That could be gas or anything else, or chemicals during the drilling process.
I think during the drilling process it's getting much better, because nowadays they don't let the geothermal fluid run off. If it's a negative impact, it's a good question, because in Iceland, I would say it's one of the largest environmental accidents. Nowadays it's known as the Blue Lagoon, because they just drilled and the geothermal fluid was just running out and accumulating in some areas. So there they figured out that it's even a positive benefit. Of course, there would be some CO2 emissions which could be mitigated, but there's always a little CO2 emissions. There could be some sulfur emitted, which in Iceland, as I mentioned, in the old part of the city, when you turned on your shower and you took hot water, you had this rotten egg smell, which is maybe also not so positive for hair, because they get a little, I don't know how to describe the feeling. Yeah, maybe it's a scale up on it. I don't know how to describe it. Touch is a little bit different than normal water. And of course, there is a noise pollution, so there is always some kind of impact.
I forgot to introduce myself. I'm Sophia with KCB. My next question is, so in order for Icelanders to really make that switch to geothermal, were you saying it was basically like a crash in the economy that really got people to change, or what else were Icelanders really being like, okay, we know that this could be a risk, like, we're talking here in Unalaska, but yeah, I'm just curious.
That's a good question. I can just guess to answer it, and I think it was first that some people started utilizing it, and then later on they got good experience, and then there was external pressure from the oil crisis, which kind of accelerated it. Then of course always the learning experience. And another thing which I think which also supported it was a little bit the economy. Like Iceland is very famous for high energy industries like aluminum smelters, and they needed a lot of energy, so geothermal and hydropower was also there to support it. So there's always a question, what is coming first, the demand for energy or the supply for energy? And I think that was slowly growing kind of in steps.
All right, looks like we're done. All right, great. So we'll go ahead and we'll wrap up. Thank you once again for coming in and giving this talk for us. I also want to thank everybody for coming out today, and I also want to note that our next program is on Friday at 7 o'clock over at Unalaska Park, Kelty Field. We are hosting the vintage baseball game. We will also be unveiling the baseball presentation put together by the Alaska State History Department folks, plus one panel by me about the history of baseball in Unalaska. So we hope to see you all out there. If you'd like to play in the game, find one of my flyers, scan the QR code, fill out the survey. And then bring a waiver on the day of, which you can find online. But once again, thank you for coming out, and we hope to see you then.
Thanks. Okay, I don't know how to turn it
I'll
off.
take care of it.
Okay.
You can just grab the phone mic. Thank you very much.